Good morning, everybody. We are absolutely delighted to have you here. This is the 9 o'clock session on Tuesday morning, April 11th, at the CALLERLAB convention here in Mesa, Arizona. And this is probably the highlight of the year for me, because this is our interview with the legends. And we have 4 legends with us. I think you're going to enjoy the interview very, very much. Because we have 4, we're not going to take a lot of time with preliminaries. I want to introduce my co-moderator here. Give a nice hand to Mike Seastrom, if he would, from Tarzana, California. My name is Jerry Junck, and it's a privilege to be here. Seated next to me, to my far left, is from Wexford, Pennsylvania, Ed Foote. Give him a nice hand. Next to him, from Palm Desert, California, Ken Bauer. And next to him is a gentleman that you may not know, but he wrote just completed writing the book, As I Saw It, about Bob Osgood's life. And give a nice hand to Paul Moore. So we're going to talk about Bob Osgood. Seated next to me is a guy who has not been calling for a long time. He's been retired about 30 years, but is a true legend. Started out in the 40s. And if you would, from right here in Mesa, Arizona, give a nice hand to John LeClair. Hey, we're going to start this interview with Ed Foote, and I'm going to turn this over to Mike.
Very good. How's everybody doing today? Okay? All right. Very good. Anytime you can't hear something or you need more volume or you even need to stand up and stretch, go right ahead and do that, okay? We're going to start out. Ed's got 52 years of calling, 44 full-time. He's called in 50 states and 6 Canadian provinces. He's had 18 calling trips to Europe and 10 different countries, a couple different calling trips down to Australia and New Zealand. He's got a home program, regularly calls for 3 square dance clubs in the Pittsburgh area, and been calling for 51 years with those clubs, 49 and 48 respectively. Ed currently travels about 2,000 or 20,000 miles a year and calls about 120 dances from coast to coast. He's been a festival caller for numerous festivals throughout the U.S. and Canada, Europe, Asia. He's been a member of CALLERLAB for 41 years and a committee chair for 30 years. He's accredited CALLERLAB caller coach. He started out in 1981 as a caller education specialist and then an accredited caller coach since 1987. He's a very prolific author and not only an editor of several instructional books on square dancing, but has been a regular contributor to American Square Dance magazine for 31 years, and does a bi-monthly column in the Northeast Square Dance magazine, he's been doing that for 26 years. Ed has also produced audio tapes and video teaching tapes, but I find a really interesting story in how Ed began to dance and then how that transitioned into calling. So, Ed, when and how did you begin dancing?
Well, I was going to school at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and it was a 2-year program to get a master's. And so in the summer between years, I worked at Bloomingdale's in New York City for a summer job. And I stayed at Columbia University, and every Friday night they had a dance at the student union there. So while I was in New York City for the summer, I would go there every Friday night and dance. They gave me the name of a contact for when I went back to Philadelphia, so I went back to Philadelphia. Decided to go to a dance one night, went out, and all the calls were different. Turns out it was all the party dance type thing in Columbia University, and in Philadelphia it was regular club level dancing with the lists of calls. And I didn't recognize anything. So I approached this as like I would as a student, and studied, went to dances 3-4 times a week. And after 3 weeks, I was able to keep up with most everything in Philadelphia. So went home to Pittsburgh, danced some there, got a list of all the callers, came back to Philadelphia, this was in December of '65. I'm dancing around and can handle anything in Philadelphia. I got home to Pittsburgh, and I'm looking for a dance, and I didn't have a partner. So it was vital that the caller's wife would be available as a partner for me when I would go to a dance. So I had this list of callers. I just picked out one and called him up and said, "Is your wife available if I come out?" "Yeah, sure." Turned out this was Pete Heckman, who was the hardest caller in the country, in the world at that time. He's the one that Lee Kopman listened to tapes of when Lee was starting. But I didn't know this. I'm only dancing 6 weeks. So I go out there and I think, well, I know everything in Philadelphia. All these calls, I don't know a thing. So I start studying 2.5 hours before every dance, memorizing the calls. And fortunately, this guy Pete, because I figured this is the way square dancing is, right? What do I know? So I'm studying all these calls, and after about 3.5, I'm going to dances 4 times a week over Christmas vacation. By the time it was time to go back to Philadelphia, I kind of worked my way up to maybe the middle of Pete Heckman's group. Went back to Philadelphia and looking for more square dances, and it turns out one of Pete Heckman's dancers had moved to Long Island and ran a tape group of Pete Heckman's calling every Saturday night. So I started going up there, and I would dance Lee Kopman on Friday night, Pete Heckman on Saturday night, and I did this for the whole second semester of my second year at school. So that's really how I got started with square dancing. So I was forced to learn challenge. It wasn't called challenge then, but I was forced to learn it 6 weeks after I first started club level dancing.
This is still how you thought square dancing was at that time.
Right, I didn't know any different.
So then your entrance to calling.
Entrance to calling was, I see a flyer on the Washington Spring Festival, which is still going on. At that time, it was 4,500 dancers held at the Sheraton Hotel and the Shoreham Hotel. It took 2 hotels to handle this thing. And all the challenge people up in Long Island said, "You don't want to go there. It's too many people." I said, "I've never seen more than like 7 squares. I want to see a bunch of people." So I went, had a great time, and just wonderful. I said, "I had such a great time, I'll go anywhere. Where can I go?" On the big flyer table, it said, "Toronto, Canada." Fine, I'll go to Toronto. Toronto, Canada, first weekend in May, and that's a Toronto convention. I think it's still going or went for numerous years. Well, at the bottom of the application form, it said, "Check here if you're a caller." Now, I didn't know what this meant. I'm only dancing 4 months. I'm still studying like 30 minutes before every dance, trying to make sure I know all these calls. So I figured if I check off this box, maybe they'll send me some free literature on how to do the latest calls. So I checked off the box. Now, it turned out back in those days, virtually all festivals had a little room off to the side where anybody could call. And anybody said they were calling, they'd stick them in there for 10 minutes just to give them a little exposure and practice and that kind of thing. But I didn't know this. So I get a letter back from Toronto saying, "You're on the program, have 20 minutes of material ready." And that was 3 weeks before the convention. So I figured, well, if I'm on the program, I better learn how to call. So copied some stuff out of Sets in Order, and Lee Kopman let me call a little bit in his basement, and Pete Heckman let me call for his group at home. But in order for these dancers to tolerate me, even calling one tip for them, I had to call challenge. So I had to learn to call challenge immediately in order to even be able to be allowed to practice. So I went up to Toronto and called, and they said, when I came off the mic, I looked a little white, but survived the tip. And then at the evening, they had the after party. And anybody could sign up. So I signed up. Now I got 50 squares on the floor. And get up there and call, and it all went okay. And so that's how I got started. Just continued from there.
You know, Ed, I think a lot of people in the dance world think you only call advanced and challenge, but can you set us straight on this?
Yeah, that's one of the things I've had to bear. A lot of people think I only call advanced and challenge, and for a number of reasons. First of all, in my first 20 years, I promoted advanced and challenge strongly because back then, some people felt that it shouldn't be allowed to exist, that this was an anathema to the square dance world. So I defended it. For my first 18 years of writing for American Square Dance magazine, I was only allowed to write on Advance and Challenge because the owners of the magazine then said, we have plenty of writers for Mainstream Plus, so we only want you to write for this. So that's what I did, but that was another perception of it. I founded and ran the National Advance and Challenge Convention, so my name was heavily associated with that. And all my diagram books were primarily Advance and Challenge because that was what sold. We didn't need, from me, Mainstream Plus books. We had the sets and order pamphlets and all. So those are the reasons why I think people have had that misconception. In actual fact, half of all my calling ever since day one has always been Mainstream Plus. And most people don't know that. My Plus Club in Pittsburgh, which is a dancer-run club, and they hired me way back. I've now been their club caller for 49 years. When I started calling and traveling, I was interested in Advance and Challenge, but I was also interested in Mainstream Plus, and I quickly realized I couldn't support my traveling calling either one. If I only wanted to call Advance and Challenge, I couldn't travel around 1,000 miles or so on a weekend calling only that, and I couldn't do this, and the same with Mainstream Plus. But if I combined them, now I could get 5, 6, and 7 dances on a weekend, because the Advance and Challenge people would adapt and dance to you morning or afternoon, and then you call the Mainstream Plus at night. So that's what I did for 20, 25 years, combining both on the weekends, and that's how I was able to be able to afford to be able to travel on all these weekends.
And after you're calling about 52 years, you've been calling more than 52 years, many callers start to slow down, but you still seem to stay pretty active.
Yeah, as you said, I'm still calling about 120 dances a year. I have 3 home programs. The Plus Club, my Advanced Club has been going 48 years. My C2 Club just celebrated 50 years last year. And I make 4 or 5 trips a year to the East Coast, Washington, D.C., Maryland, New Jersey, New York. I call in California every summer for 3 weeks out there, go to Florida in the winter, and miscellaneous other dances.
And you also have conducted caller seminars in schools all over the world. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, I just love working with callers, mainly because the opportunity doesn't nearly present itself as often as it does with with calling for Mainstream Plus. So I will give up any dance to be able to do a caller seminar. So my first caller clinic was in 1972, and I just really loved it. So any place I would go to call dances, then I would contact the local caller association and say, are you interested in a caller clinic? And that's how I was able to get a number of bookings that way.
And you were chairman of the CALLERLAB Challenge Committee for about 30 years. At the beginning, how did you mesh those programs with, inside of CALLERLAB and outside of CALLERLAB?
Well, the history of the challenge program, the word challenge did not exist in 65, and by 67 it did. So, and nobody knows how and where it changed, but somewhere in 66 the osmosis changed over to challenge. So there were no lists then, no lists anywhere. Every caller did whatever he wanted, whatever program he was calling. So in 1973 I decided we needed to have some uniformity, and we needed to have a challenge list of calls. And so I set out letters to all the challenge callers and said, give me your thoughts on what should be on a challenge list. Caught hardly any replies, maybe 5 or 6. I said, well, this is no good. We're going to have the list. How do I get input? Because it's not going to be the Ed Foote list. It's got to be a consensus of all the callers. So I sent out another letter, and I said, based on my first response, here's the list of calls. You have 30 days to respond before it's published. Whomp. Everybody responds. And this has proven a very good lesson for me in life, not just for square dancing and in CALLERLAB, but for anything in life. Brainstorming is fine to get input and ideas, but it takes a long, long time. And if you want to get something done, you say, here's the way it's going to be. You have 30 days to respond, and you always get the response. because people know it's going to go out with or without their comment. And it's worked great for while I was on the running the challenge convention. That's how I always did it. Challenge committee. Challenge committee is always involved with definitions all the time. It's still so today. You put out the definition. You say, this is the way it's going to be. You got 30 days to respond. Everybody responds. Works great.
Ed, you and Marilyn built your home in 1969 for square dancing. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I got married in 68, and we decided we wanted a house. We looked around, quickly found there were no houses where you could square dance, so we decided to build our own house, and we wanted to be able to have dances there, so we decided to build our final house first, rather than build a starter house, another one, and keep going up the line. We just built our final house first, and we don't have to worry about it. So we got this high-powered architect in Pittsburgh to design the house, and he comes back with a plan, and it was no good. I mean, we didn't like the way the kitchen was, the living room, the basement had the stairs coming right down into the middle of the basement. There was no room to dance. But what do we know? We're just young kids. We don't know how to tell this architect, who was a big name, how to do his job. So I'm stuck. So one night after my dance in 1967, I guess it was, one of the people who danced with me was a plumber, and he had a secret desire to be an architect. So I was complaining about all this. So he took one of these little square napkins and drew on the napkin his thoughts for the plan for our basement and first floor. Took these two little napkins to this high-powered architect. He says, yeah, never thought of that. Redid the blueprints, turned out perfect. Turned out perfect. Another dancer designed our second floor, and that was how our house got built. We have it finished. Our basement is a finished room with a separate outside entry so people can run their own dances if we're not home. And the hall is 28 by 32 with one post right in the middle. We can dance 4 squares very easily, 6 squares if we reverse the heads and the sides. And there's an interesting follow-up story. 14 years later, I'm out in the front yard doing something, and across the street lived a lady, real estate sales lady. And we knew her just to say hello, but I'd never been in her house. She'd never been in ours, and we just would wave and say hello. So I'm out there working in the front yard. She's out there. So we get talking, and somehow we're talking about houses. And I mentioned, in my house, I have this. And she said, I know everything that's in your house. And I said, well, how is that? She said, because your architect runs classes for real estate people, and he uses your blueprints as the example of how a house should be built.
I love it. I love it. Ed, your calling career in the square dance leadership role has been nothing short of amazing. Your impact on other callers and dancers and the activity as a whole has been kind of subtle and steady and enormous. Anyway, we want to thank both of you and your wife, Marilyn, for all that you've done for dancers and callers and for making the activity a much better and more rounded activity. Ladies and gentlemen, a nice hand for Mr. Ed Foote.
We also need to thank him for the perfect way to build a house. That's pretty cool. Blueprints. Our next caller, a personal friend, been a friend for a very, very long time to me, and had a lot of fun with him. Ken Bowery is from Palm Desert, California. And I've talked to Ken over the phone about this interview for a little bit. We're going to talk a little bit about how he got started square dancing and where. But as you know, Ken's been a recording artist for a long, long time. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So, Ken, when did you begin square dancing?
First of all, Ed, you have a square dance hall in your basement. I'll be coming through there in June. You got a spot. Like that very much. Thank you. I actually started calling in 1962. We took lessons in 61, and I had voice lessons for years before that when I was younger, and so it was pretty easy for me to get into square dancing, and I called my first square dance calling, so I called my first full dance in May of 62.
May of 62. Isn't it amazing how all of us can tell you when their first dance was? Mine was January 7th, 1967. I can just tell you. You grew up in Ottumwa, Iowa,
Yes.
and you started calling in Des Moines, right?
Well, I moved to Des Moines. That's when I
Okay.
learned to dance. Yes.
All right. I will tell you this. I started calling in 1966, and in 1968, I went to my first national convention. It was in Omaha, Nebraska in 1968. Ken had just recorded what I thought was his first singing call, but he told me later it's his second. He recorded a song for Norm Meerbach on Blue Star called First Thing Every Morning. And it was an amazing record for Ken. At that time, if you had a hit record, it could make you a star. And that record literally made Ken a star in Omaha, Nebraska. Tell him a little bit about that.
That was about the third recording I did. The others, I don't want you to know the name of them, even if it's that bad. Back then, a lot of square dancers, and the square dancers at that time purchased records. They would buy records, and that's where we got the big sales from. Was then, but it wasn't just that record that did it. About the time that record came out, I also, when I left Blue Star, Meerbach, he graciously let me go. He was very good about it. And we met a fellow named Don Franklin. You all remember Don Franklin? Wagon Wheel Records. Mm-hmm. And that really is what helped me. I got a lot of experience in the recording business from him, and also a lot of the guys that I got to work with were Jerry Haig, Burl Main, and, of course, Gary Shoemake come along.
I'm going to back up just a little bit, though, to that Blue Star recording. It was everybody at that time, at least what I was aware of when I went to that convention, we all wore a Western shirt and a string tie. Ken Bauer came in a blue blazer with a white turtleneck sweater. I'd never seen that before. And he had perfect hair. And how many singing calls did you do at that convention?
Yeah,
you said that's the only one you did.
Yeah, I did that with Marshall Flipple. He also did that with him.
You did that with him there too.
Pardon?
But you did First Thing Every Morning at that Omaha convention.
Oh, you're talking about the Omaha. I thought you meant the
no,
first festival.
No. That's the only singing call you sang.
I guess it was, yeah.
Yeah. Now, on the way home, he got so many requests to call dances. Talk about your trip home because you couldn't stay awake.
Oh, well, that was party years, Jerry. I wasn't.
He and Dee were sorting through all the requests they had for contracts.
Well, what had happened was it was getting to the point that my job, I worked for a company called Cole's Broadcasting Publishing Company. I was a printing pressman for them, Look Magazine, and I had a nice job with them, and they were awfully good to me. They let me have a few days off to go call, and I was very fortunate to, at that time, I could jump on it. I'll get to the point in a minute. I could jump on a plane and run out and call a dance in Boston and be back the next day in time to go to work. So it worked out pretty good. But after a while, it becomes where both your calling and your job starts to start declining. So we knew we had to do something, and we pretty much decided not to do much more with the square dance calling. Pardon me. But after that convention, I had booked about enough dances to keep us going for a year.
Yeah, that's what I wanted you to hear.
Well, back then, if you just hung your shingle out, you had 30 squares.
Yeah. Then Ken went on to record for Don Franklin Wagon Wheel Records, and it included Gary Shoemake, Burl Main, Jerry Haig. And Don kind of changed our record recording industry because he took tunes that hadn't been done before, took popular tunes, Mississippi, some of those, and he used horns on records, and I think that's one of the first times I heard horns on records. After Wagon Wheel was no longer active, though, Ken, Gary, Burl Main, and Jerry Haig started a company we all know as Chaparral Records. And to my knowledge, it's the first record company that produced records or had musicians in Nashville. They went to Nashville. And they knew a famous fiddle player who used to be in Dallas, Texas, in the Texas area, by the name of Johnny Gimbel. Johnny was in Nashville at that time, and they got Johnny to produce Chaparral Records for them, and he got them some famous musicians on their label. They had Charlie McCoy, who played mouth harp, Floyd Kramer, Bobby Thompson, to name a few. Talk a little bit about Johnny Gimbel and Chaparral Records.
Well, Johnny Gimbel, the reason we contacted him is because he was actually a square dancer. He had taken lessons and danced for several years to Paul Markham out in Tennessee, of course, Nashville area. And he really had knowledge in the square dancing and the proper beat, the proper things to put. When you had horns, if you did horns on this is fine, but you couldn't add this with it because it did not go well with that. So the knowledge that he gave us was tremendous. And then he helped us pick out the guy that mixed our music for us, and he was fabulous, just fabulous. And that really helped us get a good start. But I think the thing that really helped us also was, of course, square dancers buying the music, and all of us guys were full-time callers on the road, so we went everywhere in the U.S. We covered it with our music, and at that time people say, where can we buy that record? So it helped us tremendously. And Johnny would, he knew when we had a good song, and he'd put a lot of stuff into it.
Yeah.
And I think we had a pretty good seller. In the first couple of years, one record sold over 30-some thousand.
There was Something About You, Baby, I Like,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. That was that. I didn't record that.
No, Haig recorded
That was
it.
he did. But that was
See, this is what I wanted you to hear.
Well, it was my song. He was out to my house calling for us out in Hemet, California. We worked in a travel trailer park there, and I'd have guys come through on occasion. And Jerry had called there, and afterwards he wanted to go down. It was a little bar in our town. It was called the Stables Bar. And we had a little guy. The guy there's a friend. I didn't know him well. I'd only been there a couple of times. And he said he played a one-man band, and he played this song, Something About You, Baby, I Like. And I said, hey, that'll make a good song. And he said, oh, yeah, it really would. So we got a hold of Johnny, and somehow or another he got the music behind it and made the music. And it was fabulous. A very good song. It was the biggest seller we had. And Jerry Haig, my dear friend, I love him to pieces. Baby Bliss. That's what I called him. He cried tears until I gave him that song. So a couple months later, it wasn't long till we had another one come out there. It was called Rockin' in Rosalie's Boat. Gary Shoemake found that somewhere, and Mr. Haig played Poor Boy to him too, and he got that song. And it doesn't end there.
And Haig is not here to defend himself.
Well, he'd be happy. He'd be happy to come here and say, that's right, I got it from
He
you.
would, as a matter of fact.
But then I recorded some music I got the music from Buddy Weaver, and it was called the Red Red Robin song. Really good. And I told Gary Shoemake, I said, I'll never give Haig another piece of music. He never brings one to us, and he takes the good stuff. Bless his heart. And he got that one away from me, from Buddy. 40 years later. But he did a fabulous job, and it was a really tremendous seller.
Yeah. Chaparral Records, and I'm sure all of you guys still use a lot of those records. I know I do. This brings us to, you moved away from Des Moines, Iowa, and I think 1972 you went to Hemet, California.
73.
73. And how you became the resident caller at a resort there in Hemet, and how did that come to be?
Well, Johnny LeClair. Johnny was one of the first guys to hire me to do a weekend festival out in Wyoming. It wasn't Riverton. It's your home. Rollins, Wyoming. Yeah, and he hired me for several years, and that's how I got to know him. Then he started doing a thing at Trailer Village in Mesa, Arizona.
We're going to get to that. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's when I found out that this was I had called for the fellow that built this park, and that's why I moved to California. I wanted to get off the road. I was on the road full time.
And had a young family.
I did, yeah. Well, kids went with me. Oh, did they?
Yeah. I don't know if I can ask this or not. I heard a story.
Why don't you whisper to me first?
No. I heard a story one time that Dee and the kids were picking up cans in a ditch. Is that true?
Oh, yeah. You mean when the car broke down?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we had her dad had an automobile dealership, and he sold us a car. And I had worked with Johnny. We were at you and I and Burl worked in Burl's place up on the mountain. Lighted Lantern. And I had to fly out and do something somewhere. And so Dee took the kids. We were going on into California and started working and do that little stint in California. And she got with all the kids and had neighbor kids with us and had 2 dogs and a cat. I think we had a turtle. I think it was the good days. I'm not sure. But anyway, the car broke down, so she was stuck out there for a long time. It was kind of sad in a way, too. She said, I said, what happened? Well, they had everything to eat and drink in the car. That wasn't a problem. You know what her biggest fear was? She said, I knew somebody had to help us, but I was afraid somebody would stop and help us.
Dee, Ken's wife, Dee, is a lot of fun. One night, I was going to stay with Bauer in Palm Desert because I was calling L.A. And I called him up, and he said, well, you can't stay with us. I'm calling in Mesa. I said, really? He said, but he said, I'm going to drive all the way to San Diego because we got to get on a cruise ship. I said, well, that's good because I'm going to drive all the way back to Mesa because you ain't home. So we talked on the phone back and forth as we met each other on I-10. And about 3 a.m. I called, and Dee answered the phone, and she said, isn't this fun? And I didn't call again. I said, what's Bauer doing? She said, he's sleeping, wouldn't you know? So I never called back that night. Do you remember that?
Well, I remember that. She has an odd way of saying things. I knew her favorite. You know, I did the park many years like Johnny did. Johnny showed me how to do it. That's where I got the idea from. But anyway, if you have a bad night, I've only had one in calling, but it was over spin chain through. And, of course, my wife went to every session, took the money, helped me out. And I was calling, it was the advanced group. It's back when I was calling a lot of advanced. And I called spin chain through, and, of course, the whole floor went down. And so I called it a second time, did it again. Well, I didn't throw a fit, but you could tell I was mad because the veins were popping out in my neck. You know how. So I went back, and my wife was a dancer at the time. She had danced, and her square was even broken down. And she's back there counting stuff in the back. And I said, you see that? I said, these people, I called spin chain through, and I lost the whole floor. She said, well, maybe they're having a bad day. I said, you kidding me? I said, they did twice. And she said, well, maybe things aren't right. What is it? I said, well, for crying out loud, if they want to dance this level, they should know how to do spin chain through. And she said, when's the last time you called it for us? Think of that.
Yeah.
I bet I hadn't called it in 2 years. Well, now, really, Jerry, let me tell you what will straighten you out when you're a caller. When you think you're pretty good, you straighten you out. The drive's an hour home.
Yeah.
She gets in the car. You drive along.
And it's quiet.
It's quiet. And I'm talking like in tongues, really trying to get this quiet. And pretty soon it comes out. Here's how it goes. My, didn't we impress ourselves tonight? And it's another 45 minutes home.
I will enlighten you just further. The first festival I ever called was in Westmoreland, Kansas, and I took my wife along because that's the only person I was going to know. And partway through the dance, I saw her square up with a guy in the back of the hall, and the squares I had went down, and I looked up and I said, Sharon, who's your corner? And she goes, oh. So after the tip, I walked over there, and I said, Sharon, you can help me out just a little bit. I said, this is my first festival. And she said, who they paying for that dance, you or me? True story. True story. You've called all over the world. Do you know, you've called all over the world. How many? Do you have any idea?
Jeez, I don't even know for sure.
But you've called Japan, you've called Europe, called in Australia.
China. I went to call in Russia. I was supposed to, and this is in '86. And you're in a communist country at that time. You're not allowed to gather in groups. So then I thought, well, I'll just go on in and do it anyway. And they're not looking. They took my passport and said, if we hear of you doing this, you won't get your passport back. That'll stop you from calling.
Yeah.
Quickly.
This is kind of like Ed. This is a truly amazing calling career. He's traveled all over the world, the recordings, and the many, many friends he's made. My thanks to Dee for sharing you with all of us all these years. And ladies and gentlemen, a nice hand to Ken Bauer. All right. As I said, we have 4 callers here today, 4 legends that we wanted to interview. The next 2 tie in together just a little bit, but I want to start with this gentleman to my immediate left. This is John LeClair. He's from Riverton, Wyoming originally, and his wife Marge is not here today, but John quit calling about 30 years ago. He retired from calling, but he was a full-time caller for a long, long time, ran weekends early on in the days. And so, John, when did you start calling?
I started in 1950.
1950. By the way, John is now 94 years old. So you know that. Okay. And when you started calling, you were in Riverton, Wyoming. Did you have a club there, or did you do something before you started calling full time?
Yes, I grew up on a cattle ranch. My folks had a cattle ranch, and I had 2 brothers, and we had a large cattle ranch, but I figured that with 2 other brothers, probably wasn't enough there for me to stay, so I was looking for something else to do at the particular time, so square dancing came around at about the right time.
About the right time. And when did you start calling full time? Right away?
Well, now that's a good question, because I probably started calling full time in 1953.
Okay. Now, one of the things you have to remember, John lived in Riverton, Wyoming, and that's a very remote area. And when he did traveling, he did lots of miles. John traveled in areas where most of us don't go, except some people that I know. So how far did you travel to dances, John?
Well, I had a club that was about 150 miles from my home base. So I called there once a week. As a matter of fact, when I first started calling, I had 4 clubs. I had one in Riverton, I had one in DuBois, I had one in Lander. These are all in Wyoming, and I had one in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. That was 150 miles away.
So those were long drives at night. And Wyoming doesn't necessarily have the greatest weather, let me tell you. Okay, now, John has ties to Bob Osgood. Most of us here at CALLERLAB are familiar with Bob Osgood and the Sets in Order magazine. And I actually have a record at home that you recorded, I think, about 1953 on the Sets in Order label. Did you record for any other companies than Sets in Order, John?
Yes, I recorded for Scope and Windsor.
Okay. You were not on Old Time or any of those?
No.
Okay. Okay. The other thing that I want you to note, John brought some things along here. He was one of the first to start conducting weekends, and I think they were called Dancing Holidays. Am I correct?
Dancing Fun.
Dancing Fun. All right. Thank you for correcting me. One of the most popular was held in Rawlins. He also held one in Laramie. And he had famous people that came to some of the early weekends in the early 50s. Bob and Becky Osgood came to the weekends in Rawlins or Laramie, I think you told me.
Yeah, just let me clarify this. I did not, I was not the sponsor of the one in Laramie. It was the Western Square Dance Association.
Okay. But Bob and Becky Osgood and Ginger came. It was Bob and Ginger at that time. Okay. Bob and Ginger. Also, a couple that came with them, a very, very famous couple, a guy named Chuck and his wife, Dottie Jones. You know Chuck Jones today, if you watch cartoons, as the creator of Bugs Bunny. And Chuck Jones did a great deal for square dancing, promoting square dancing all over. Chuck Jones made some of the flyers for John. Some of these, we want these back. This flyer here was done in 1951 for the University of Wyoming, and it's got Bugs Bunny riding a bucking bronco. And John said, I got to apologize for this. The guy that was calling with me did some really neat choreography, and I wrote it on the flyer. So that, who was with you? Do you remember?
Pardon?
Who was with you then that you wrote that down?
I don't remember, really.
Okay.
Evidently, I thought it was quite good.
Anyway, there's another thing right here. Mike, could you hold it up for me, please? In 1972, John LeClair came to Mesa, Arizona to call in Travel Trailer Village. And Jerry Haig went to Mission, Texas to call it Tropic Star or Peppermint Palace, I don't know which. And then a year later, Ken Bauer went to Hemet, California to work these resorts. Those three guys taught us, who work in these parks, how to do it. They created the programs. John created the program here for Travel Trailer Village. And John, talk a little bit about how that came about and a little bit about calling in the parks for the first time.
First of all, we were hired. Actually, we were a couple by the name of Marge and Ed Crum actually got us a job, and they already had the program set up for the year that I signed the contract. And the first year, the cost for the people to dance was 50 cents a couple. Now, I didn't stay at that because before the year was over, we had raised it. But anyhow, to go back and think about how the prices have changed, at the present time, Trailer Village, if you stay overnight, was $4 back in 1971. Now it's $55 a night. If you stay a year, it was $400. Now you stay a year, it's $3,600. So times have changed. But we started at 25 cents a person, 50 cents a couple, and then we raised it to 50 cents a person, or $1 a couple, and $1.25 for out-of-park people. But going back in reality, I had a lot of beginner classes where I had over 40 squares of dancers. And I think the reason for this was the fact that we had just gotten through the war, and people had a rough time, and they were looking for something to do. And square dancing came around at the proper time, and people were eager to enter into some type of recreation.
I think that's exactly right, because a lot of our dancers who are passing on now all came through World War II. They really did in the Korean War. At the trailer village, John would bring guys in for specials. These are some of the guys that you worked with, that you brought in?
Every Sunday night, once a month, we had a caller special, and we brought in some of the top-notch callers around the country. Here are some of the people I just remembered offhand. Marshall Flippo. Is Flip here?
Yeah.
Bob Fisk, John Jones, Ken Bauer, Frank Lane, Gary Shoemake, Dave Taylor, Milton Luttrell, and Ron Snyder.
Some of those guys are in this room. Why don't you guys stand up so they can see who you are? Melton, John, Flippo. And what I want you to understand, A lot of you are aware of the trailer parks in the wintertime, the winter square dance programs that some of us are privileged to be a part of. But John LeClair, Jerry Haig, Ken Bauer, they created the programs that we now enjoy. They made a place for us and showed us how to make it run and how to do it. And I think that's really something. So, John, I thank you for that very, very much. What do you think of that flyer over there? I happen to work in these trailer parks, and I've never seen a woman like that by the pool. Not one time.
I haven't either.
Mike, you have anything? Okay. All right. And John explained that the classes were 40 squares frequently. John and Marge decided to retire. What year? You decided to retire. What year?
I retired in 1986, but I had dates that were out on the road, so I actually finished up in 1987.
Yeah. And he retired because he wanted to do other things. He wanted to have some time, and he and Marge have enjoyed a great 30 years since that time. John and Marge worked at the Suns basketball games, the baseball games as ushers. He's met most of the stars, have you not?
Yes, we worked. Actually, we worked for the Diamondbacks, which is the baseball team, the Phoenix Suns, and also the Dodge Theater. I worked 20 years. Marjorie worked 18 years. I worked nearly 3,000 events in those 20 years. And I had the opportunity to see all the great athletes and all the, like Lady Gaga and a whole bunch of things that I didn't want to see. But it was really something. We were always interested in sports, so that's the reason we got the job, and we really, certainly enjoyed it. Really a super time.
Would you not say that's an interesting 94 years? I talked to John at length here the last couple of years about getting him over for this, and he was consented to do that. So, John, I thank you very much, and if you would, give another nice hand to John LeClair.
Just let me say one thing, if I may, before I finish. Marjorie sends her best. She's in assisted living, and she's doing quite well. But she wanted me to say hi to everybody, and sorry she couldn't be here. I do want to say one other thing, that in October, we celebrated our 70th wedding anniversary. Just one thing before I leave. I think I called everything that I did every job I was asked to do except one. At Lightning S Ranch one year, a gentleman from San Diego was in attendance, and he said, "I'd like to have you come down to San Diego and call a dance." And I said, "Oh, I'd probably be happy to. Give me some more information." He said, "Well, it's at a nudist colony." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Are the people all naked?" And he says, "Yes." And I said, "Well, how about what can I wear?" He said, "Your stockings." And that's the only dance I ever turned down. But you know what? Looking back, I wish I had have taken it.
John, I can tell you this, Marshall Flippo still carries the flyer for that dance. That's a fact. All right. Again, a nice hand for John. Thank you, John. Our next interview here is with Paul Moore, his wife, Mary. Mary isn't here, is that right?
No, she's not.
Okay. Paul Moore. And Paul has just completed a book, as I saw it, it is the life story of Bob and Becky Osgood. And we're not really interviewing Paul. We're going to talk about Bob Osgood, who in my...
When Jerry asked me to do this session about 3 years ago, I was like, is this a case of mistaken identity? He's talking to the wrong person. And then I realized I am a proxy for Bob Osgood.
That's right. One of the things that I love about our interview with legends is that we can get on tape and document some of the things that we just talked about with these three gentlemen. And we missed Bob. Bob is gone, and we didn't get him on tape. Paul has just completed this book, and I was privileged to edit part of it, or at least to go through it. So it's been interesting. Bob Osgood, in my opinion, was the most visionary person in the activity by far. And I'll just go start down through here. It's just some random thoughts that I put down. Bob realized early on we had a need for a national magazine, and he created Sets and Order magazine. He saw that we had a need for the National Square Dance Convention. He created the National Square Dance Convention in 1952. In the 60s, he realized that there were no standardized lists. You couldn't call in New York and come out to California and call because they danced different calls. So he saw a glaring need for standardization of square dance calls. In order to do that, he saw the need for an organization such as CALLERLAB, and it was his vision to create CALLERLAB, which came about in 1974. Those are the things that I saw about Bob. And he had a passion to teach people to square dance in the LA area and all around the world. And he also dealt with a lot of people in the movies: Dean Martin, Frank Sinatra, John Ford, the Western movie producer. His neighbor was Gene Kelly. He choreographed a lot of dances that we see in the old Western movies. And he also had a weekly TV show in L.A. So I'm going to kind of turn this over to Paul to give us a little bit of history of the vision of Bob Osgood.
Well, I think what you did is you gave it a nice teaser, and everybody wants to know more details about what Jerry already talked about. Buy the book. But there are things that the book ended up being 600 pages after we cut about 300 pages out. And there are some stories that people probably do not know. Bob was an outstanding caller in his own right. But somewhere after he started calling, and I think in 1946, he had done some oddball things before that. But in 46, he was calling while being a national representative and public relations person for the Squirt soft drink company. And he found that by traveling for the company, and they'd pick up the bills, then he could go out and dance on Saturday and Friday night, wherever you happened to be. Had a chance to meet people and found out the needs of all of the areas in the country, which was almost always no common terminology. But they did have a common interest in dancing to the music, and so he was able to take that. But by talking to people all over, and they picked his brain, is that how you do it in California? How do ladies get their costumes? Where can you buy costumes? Well, we don't. We make them. And he decided that any magazine that he put together should be just an information gathering area. He thought of himself as an ombudsman, which meant that people could feed information through him. He could share it. People could respond to it. And he very quickly attracted a core of writers. And we've already seen the Chuck Jones stuff. Chuck wrote a column for Sets and Order magazine for about 6 years, I think. Whatever went across Chuck's mind, and you know how the Roadrunner goes. That, by the way, Roadrunner was invented by Chuck Jones. So Bob really wanted to be an ombudsman, to share information about square dancing, and because of all of that sharing, it led to a number of things. where Bob didn't necessarily start the movement, but he's the one who put the energy behind it to make it happen.
Bob had an uncanny ability to have ideas, have a vision, and in that vision, he would get people to believe it was their idea.
Very true.
He had an uncanny ability to do that.
He was the type of person who could tell you to go somewhere, and you'd look forward to the journey. You know where the somewhere was.
When he had the vision for CALLERLAB, sets an order, for those of you who are newer callers, sets an order, Bob had a Hall of Fame. And I think there were 11 guys in that Hall of Fame. Am I correct? Or maybe more.
More around 28.
But 11 guys he chose to get together to try to form CALLERLAB. And he convinced those guys we needed standardization of lists. We needed an organization. And as Hall of Famers, it was their job to convince the ordinary, the club callers, that this was the way to go. And that's how it got started.
Very true. But Bob did something before the first meeting of the Hall of Fame folk, is he had started the summer dance vacations at Asilomar, a beautiful park up in Monterey, California, right on the coast. And he had started off, he had one session to begin with, 1951, and they sold out, 180 dancers. And they were looking for, well, what are we going to do next year? You know, these same people are going to want to come back. How do we go ahead and get more? He ran a second week, and it sold out also. And then they decided, let's do a weekend session in the winter. And so he was running those 3 dance sessions. And then because of some other things that went on before, going all the way back to 1961, there was a meeting of callers in Colorado. Herb Gregerson, I think, was the leader on that, with Ed Gilmore and just another long list of great people. And we need to do something to standardize. But a lot of people in the country were against standardization. You don't want to be locked into the box, too much structure. So it took another 10 years before they could do anything, and then they invited 14, 15 Hall of Fame callers to come to Asilomar, just on the idea of, we're going to honor you guys for being in the Hall of Fame. And it had the special portraits that had been painted to hang at the Sets in Order Hall. And he conned these guys into showing up at Asilomar, partly because the weekend was free. Bob paid the whole bill on that. And after Joe Louis did a little roast, and I guess he roasted Marshall pretty good. And Flip is back here. He is one of the founding members of CALLERLAB. I think there are only 2 still alive. Yeah. Flippo and Frank Lane is still alive up in Estes Park, Colorado. Unfortunately, Dave Taylor passed away just last year or so. So anyway, there are only 2 of them left. Joe Louis roasted Flippo.
You'd like to roast Flippo? Is that right, Bauer?
Maybe we should just have Flippo come up here and we'll start a roast. But I'm not sure we can all tell the right stories. But anyway, that 1971 meeting at Asilomar, just the Hall of Fame callers, and then they said, they sent invitations out to a number, and people couldn't make it. They would be invited to the next meeting, and the growth of CALLERLAB was very slow to begin with. If you attended one on an invitation, then you had the right to suggest someone for the next meeting. You could not invite that person. You could only suggest the name to the board.
That's right.
And it continued to grow until about 76, when they opened it up, that you could nominate 2 or 3 people, but to get into CALLERLAB, you needed to be invited by somebody who was a member. by keeping it exclusive, then the reputation of the group grew, and we all like to be a member of the in-group, and Bob knew that. Snob appeal has a lot of weight. And so, here you've got all of these Hall of Fame callers, and I want to be part of that group. And it grew quickly, and by 1980, they're looking at something like 900 callers having joined, 600 showing up for conventions. And it was basically it was Osgood willpower that got people to join.
Bob was a most interesting guy. How many of you had the pleasure of meeting Bob? Quite a number of you. As such, you all realize that when Bob Osgood would sit down and talk to you, he would actually talk to you, but he would ask you about what's going on in your area. I know Mike Hogan told me he sat with him in the airport in Nashville, and Mike could not believe that Bob was actually interested in what's going on in Omaha, Nebraska. He did the same with me, and I'm sure with all of you. He had an uncanny ability to listen, and then you would discover some of what you said would show up in a magazine. You may not have your name in there, but Bob listened, and he was a great listener.
Well, I think, taped every convention or meeting he went to, and there are, I think I still have 8 boxes of audio tape. Buddy's, how many boxes of cassettes did you do? Buddy was with me somewhere and opened his mouth at the wrong time, and so I delivered boxes and boxes of cassette tapes. I still have the reel-to-reels, and they take a few hours each, including repair time, because we're talking about tapes going back to the early 50s. He held conversations with people, and they'd be mailing cassettes or reel-to-reel tapes back and forth, and you get a letter from so-and-so. It'll be 2 sides of a 7-inch tape, and it'll go on for an hour and a half. The guy just, well, Bob, this is picking up for where I left off 3 weeks ago, and this is what I'm thinking about now, and they're absolutely fascinating. You're listening to these absolutely knowledgeable, fascinating people for an hour, hour and a half, or 2 minutes. It would be that much on a tape. Just marvelous listening. But back to, I said earlier that Bob was a caller, but with the magazine going as crazy as it did, and having the Asilomar program, and the year after he started the Asilomar, he was approached by Ed Gilmore and a couple of other dancers from the Riverside, California area saying, we'd like to have a national convention. And Bob was not on the original program. He had a booking up in Northern California. He could not be at the first. But Bob Van Antwerp, Osa Matthews, and I'm trying to think of Cal Golden were at that first. And when the 2001, the 50th anniversary came around, they had Osa Matthews calling on the same stage as she did back in 1952 for the first national. That's also when CALLERLAB gave Bob the Millennium Award, the only one that will ever be honored as the caller of the 20th century. So, if you would like to see that, do not steal it, because my name is on the contract with the University of Denver, where it's all been preserved. But Bob could no longer call squares because he could not keep up with the changes of the shift from pattern dancing to, mixing up the choreography by calling basics. And so when he dropped out of calling, he still wanted to be on the mic, and so he started a contra dance group at the Sets at Order Hall. It was the Courtly Contras, and a marvelous group. And he kept that going from, I would guess, about 1970 until 2002.
Yeah.
He still had that group going.
We're getting short on time, and I wanted everybody to understand that Bob Osgood also worked heavily in the movie industry. In the 50s, early 50s, late 40s, early 50s, how many of you have watched old westerns with square dance scenes in them? Many of those scenes were choreographed by Bob Osgood. He lived in Bel Air. His next-door neighbor was Gene Kelly. Many of those scenes were choreographed by Bob and either called by Bob or Fenton Jones or Les Gocher.
Les Gocher did one of the most famous ones.
Yeah.
Bob was involved with Pappy Shaw, who was, the real inspiration. And Bob would always say that Pappy was the leader. He's the only one to really consider as being a leader in square dance. But
Bob also had a club, a loose net club. Gene Kelly told him that square dancing was the best recreation he'd ever seen. And he said...
Gene watched Bob's television show.
Yeah, Bob had a weekly television show in L.A. on Sunday nights. Mm-hmm. It was weekly and was very popular. They wanted clean TV, for family-type TV. It was on in the 50s. Gene Kelly did his rehearsals in his garage. He had a wood floor in there, and he decided that they needed some recreation for the movie stars. They can't mix with ordinary people because they wouldn't leave them alone. So Bob called regularly for people such as John Wayne, Gene Kelly, went to their homes and stuff.
And the movie Summer Stock with Gene Kelly and...
Ginger Rogers.
No, not Ginger Rogers. Judy Garland, thank you very much. The name was going to come eventually, but Judy Garland, it was just a kind of a fun thing that Judy Garland ran a farm, and every Saturday night they had the local community dance that took over the barn. Gene Kelly had an amateur theater group that came out and rented the farm to be able to rehearse and be ready to go on the road. And the two conflict came, the country folk and the city folk all ended up in the barn with choreography that Bob did. They trained a caller to put on the show, and you had the strangest mixture of Portland fancy, if anybody knows that dance, and laces and graces, and modern tap dancing. And the theater folk come jumping down out of the hayloft to get out on the floor. Marvelous fun scene.
Two of
How many have seen Son-in-Law? You seen Son-in-Law?
Yeah.
Yeah. You've got to see it. If nothing else, then it features Ernie Kinney.
Ernie Kinney.
And one of the great comedic scenes in film is watching Ernie Kinney going into the
Jumped off
pit.
the stage. I was sitting in a movie with my wife, and I saw that. Ernie came on. I said, "My God, that's Ernie Kinney," real loud. Everybody looked at me.
Bob choreographed a square dance scene for the last movie that Jerry Lewis and Dean Martin did together. And unfortunately, the tension showed. But it was a Western, and Jerry Lewis was his usual klutzy self. And they have a square dance in the barn, or in a bar. And Jerry and Dean were going to be calling, and I cannot remember what the sequence exactly was. I think I have the script, actually. But anyway, it gets all turned inside out and upside down. And when the previews came out in the theaters, the square dance scene was there. And Bob was pushing it, hey, go see the movie. You got to see Partners. But the executives at the theater measured, and it was 4 or 5 minutes over the recommended time for the length of a movie to show. And so they cut out the square dancing entirely. But you can find the trailer, and it has about 15 seconds of it.
This brings us about to the end of the hour here, Mike, if you would. I want you have a question first.
May I make a comment? something that I wanted everybody to know, that Johnny said he was raised on a cattle ranch, which he was. Before he married, he was a professional rodeo cowboy, riding broncs. And he was also one of the original members of the Board of Governors of CALLERLAB.
That's right.
He was the first chairman of the Mainstream Committee. And I had the pleasure of presenting the CALLERLAB Milestone Award to John. And sometime back, an article came out in American Square Dance magazine about Stan Burdick and all of his travels, and that he had been to 20 different countries around the world doing square dancing one way or another. The most traveled caller in the world. And I said, no, I can trump that because I've been to 24 different countries. Well, not after Al Brundage passed away and his obituary was printed, he'd been to 37 different countries as a caller. That trumped me. That left me in. Last year, Deborah and I had the opportunity to stay over an extra day here in Phoenix, and we got with Johnny and Marge and had a dinner with them and talked to them. Listen to this. 57 different countries as a square dance caller.
That's right. That's right. This brings it to a conclusion. And Mike, if you would, please.
I just have one more thing to say. At one of my first conventions on the Board of Governors, I was flying home, and Bob and I were sitting together, Bob Osgood, and I said, and I was frustrated. It was my first convention on the board, and the infighting and the bickering and the stuff that was going on the board was just, to me, I couldn't believe it, you know. These were all heroes and mentors and people that I really respected, and I said to Bob, I said, I'm just frustrated with being on the board and all the bickering, and I said I just can't believe that there's not more respect amongst the callers in CALLERLAB. And he said to me, he said, we're a young organization, and he said it's something I might not see in my lifetime, but I know for sure that you're going to see it in your lifetime. And I think when I look around the last several conventions that we've had, that there's more mutual respect amongst each one of us, that we're all kind of in that same boat, we're all part of this same huge activity, and it's one of the most pleasing things that I think I've seen, that Bob's vision really came true, that there is that kind of respect in this organization that makes us all part of an amazing community. So let's keep it going.
Yeah. Give a nice hand to Mike Seastrom, if you would. Also, I want a really nice hand for Ed Foote, Ken Bauer, Paul Moore as a proxy to Bob Osgood, and Johnny LeClair. And I know, thank you. And I know this session is over. Some of you would maybe like to have some photos. We'll keep these guys here for a little bit. If you'd like to have some photos, please come up. We want these flyers, too, that Johnny brought. We want those back. And also, Flippo, you want to come up here? Flip, they'd like to have you in this photo. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being a part of this. Thanks a lot.